Good morning and welcome everyone to the third session of the Global Innovative Growth Forum. I am Professor Young-wook Park from the KAIST College of Business, and I'm honored to be chairing the session. Before getting started with the session, let me briefly introduce how the session is organized. First, we will hear from the impressive speakers today, who will each deliver their talks in approximately 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a short discussion which will be led by our discussant today, Professor Chang Gun Lee. We are privileged today to be hosting a diverse group of world-renowned experts who will share with us wisdom and insights on digital innovative growth. Thank you all for joining us today. The third session addresses the lights and shadow of digital innovative growth in the age of living with COVID-19. As we are all aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has turbocharged the digital transformations of many aspects of our lives and economies, bringing with it so many benefits to societies, including powering new innovative growth models. On the other hand, digital innovative growth is also raising a host of challenges, including governance issues related to emerging technologies, data, and on the future of jobs, etc. This session will share insights on digital innovations and growth from globally renowned experts, many of whom have worked long in the field as leading academics or thought leaders shaping the digital governance agenda at a global stage. The session deep dives into the question of sustainable growth through digital innovation and responsible development through governance mechanisms that mitigates increasing risks posed by the ongoing disruptions across different sectors. Our first speaker today is Professor Michael Cusumano, who is the Sloan Management Review Distinguished Professor and Deputy Dean at the MIT School of Management. Professor Cusumano previously held a joint appointment in the School of Engineering at MIT. He specializes in strategy, product development, and entrepreneurship in computer software, as well as automobiles and consumer electronics. At MIT, he has recently taught platform strategy and entrepreneurship, as well as strategy and the CEO. He has extensive experience working in Asia. In 2016 and 2017, he was on leave as Special Vice President and Dean of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the Tokyo University of Science, where he founded the Tokyo Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center and designed a new mid-career management of technology curriculum, as well as a new business school that merged the Graduate School of Innovation and the School of Management. Professor Cusumano has published 14 books and more than 120 articles and columns. His latest book is The Business of Platforms: Strategy in the Age of Digital Competition, Innovation, and Power, co-authored with Annabelle Gower and David Yoffe. Professor Cusumano, thank you for joining us today. We are very eager to hear your insights, and you may begin your presentation.
Hey, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and with distinguished panelists as well. Let me share my slides. And again, my hope is to give some insights from the book research that we did, but also some more recent follow-up research. And again, I will explain what we mean by that. So the tension that we've been writing about more recently is between the Wild West economic environment that platforms began in and issues of how to regulate them, or should we expect more self-regulation? So the first point, and I think everyone understands this at this point as well, is that digital platforms, as we now call them, are among the most valuable companies in the world, the first trillion-dollar businesses. And we also see different types of platform business models extremely popular among the private billion-dollar companies, which we call unicorns, and many other startups of small and medium size. So we estimate roughly 60 to 70% of the business plans that we see, myself and my co-authors, are platform ventures of one sort or another. So we really need to understand platforms, and we need to figure out, in some ways, how to rein them in. So in my book with David Yaffe from Harvard Business School and Annabelle Gower from University of Surrey. We really tried to put together research that all three of us have done going back 25 years, even 30 years. And again, we were studying computer software at the very beginning of the internet. And these were really the first platforms. So we've thought about how to understand them and study them more quantitatively as well as qualitatively. So we've broken up all platforms into two types. The first type we call innovation platforms. Annabelle Gower and I published a book in 2002 called Platform Leadership. This was largely about innovation platforms. I published a book in 1995 with Richard Selby called Microsoft Secrets, and that was also about innovation platforms. And that even dated back to mainframes and IBM. So this type of platform is where there is a technology such as a personal computer or a smartphone that serves as a foundation for third-party companies to create their own products and services that complement that platform technology, make it increasingly valuable. So the platform serves as an intermediary to bring together innovators, let's say, and users. And the network effect between those two sides of the market can be extremely powerful. The other type of platform that we began to see in the mid-1990s when the internet emerged, innovation platforms, by the way, we can even trace back to the 1960s and the IBM mainframe. But transaction platforms were, at least in the digital age, more associated with the internet. And these are essentially marketplaces or sharing economy exchanges where the platform brings together buyers and sellers or renters and users. It could also be users and advertisers. So we mix in here marketplaces, social media networks, sharing economy platforms, many different types. But the basic idea is to enable a transaction through the platform. And the business model is to either charge for that transaction or charge advertisers. The most powerful companies in the digital world are really hybrid companies that are doing both types of platforms. They are innovating and they're also finding ways to link buyers and sellers through a transaction mechanism. So this is our basic typology. We also began our book, The Business of Platforms, published in 2019, with a study that was quantitative of the leading platforms in the space of personal computers, internet services, and smartphones. So we started with the Forbes Global 2000 list. We had some criteria for which firms we looked at. We excluded older platforms, and firms had to have at least 20% of their revenues coming from a multi-sided market driven by network effects, which is our definition of a platform market. There were 43 firms in this bucket. I don't have time to go into all the details, but they were relatively similar in size, quite large, about $4.5 billion in sales. We also compared them to 100 companies in the same industries, but that were standalone product or service companies. So we compared platforms to non-platforms. So the platform companies and the control sample had about the same amount of sales, about $4.5 billion a year. But the platforms achieved this with half the number of employees. They had twice the sales growth rates, almost twice the operating profits, and almost 3 times the market values. And again, market values are associated with growth rates and profits, but the small number of employees was quite striking to us, and also the growth rates. Again, they're leveraging networks, they're leveraging assets outside the company rather than owning the assets, like a rental firm or even an innovation platform that relies on innovators creating applications outside the company. So clearly we can understand the economics of these companies, but there's a darker side to what has been going on, particularly in the world of social media. And we trace some of this back to Section 230, the U.S. Communications Decency Act of 1996. And the argument here is that if there are not consequences for the behavior of these firms, whether they are selling counterfeit goods on a marketplace or allowing any type of information, even harmful information, political or health wise information to be distributed on a platform. There's a moral hazard here, but there's also a potential tragedy in the commons in that the internet as a common resource for commerce and exchange of information can be damaged, already has been damaged. So the problem with Section 230, again, this goes back to the early days of the internet. The platforms were declared to be these, let's say, neutral intermediaries. This one quote here, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So the platforms were able to have all sorts of information and even products and services in some cases, and basically say they're not responsible for it. So this law fueled platform growth in early years. It also helped companies like Amazon, for example, and there were other sectoral laws which they also did not have to follow. For example, state taxes in some cases, or labor laws, or insurance. Airbnb, for example, is it a hotel or is it a software app? Or Uber, is it a taxi company or is it a software app? But these lack of consequences have also created problems in our ability to trust the internet and even trust these companies in their different businesses. So we also looked historically at other industries. So clearly, government regulation becomes difficult when technologies are new, especially also when they're complex and evolving quickly. So government regulators don't often have the expertise to understand new technologies and new markets, and things keep changing. Clearly, this was the case with digital platforms. But what we have also seen historically is that when companies have recognized that their bad behavior might actually harm their ability to do business and grow and sell products and services reliably, or if their bad behavior encourages mistrust in these platforms, then we find that they do self-regulate. And there's also a need for some government oversight or pressure or threat of regulation to force that behavior. So we've seen this time and time again. We don't have to go through all the examples, but we went through a few that were related to the content or product issues that we saw with digital platforms. So in a recent article that is just published this year, Annabelle Gower and David Yaffe and myself published this piece. It's a very simple matrix that showing that if the probability of invasive or aggressive regulation from a government authority is high, and the costs of regulation are high to the firm in terms of business impact, then we're going to see platforms fighting. We're going to see, as we've seen with historical companies, they're going to resist regulation, and we're going to have lawsuits, for example. They're going to fight labor laws, for example, or the gig economy, or self-preferencing in search, or bundling issues. And we've seen this historically. However, if government can introduce, or if companies can themselves introduce some type of regulation without destroying the business models of these firms, but there is a threat of government regulation, then we're more likely to see self-regulation emerge, that companies will try to curb the excesses of their operations and create a healthier business and a healthier market and healthier competition. And again, they don't do this out of charity or goodwill. They do it really for self-preservation. So we've seen this in a number of cases, and I can summarize that a little bit more clearly in just a list here. So I've already explained the moral hazard and tragedy of the commons fear that we have, and also the notion that self-regulation is not likely to occur if the costs are too high. But where we've had credible threats of regulation in the United States, we have seen firms step up and regulate their own behavior. Again, sometimes it's taken decades, but for tobacco ads, for example, self-preferencing in airline reservations, social media ads for terrorism or pornography or child abuse. The other observation from history has been that we sometimes see coalitions of firms emerge to regulate their own behavior. By a coalition, I mean a group of firms agreeing to adopt certain practices so that the playing field is level. And so they are not competing unfairly if one regulates and another does that. So we've seen that in movies, video games, again, tobacco and alcohol advertisements, largely for children, and bans on terrorist and child abuse ads. So we do hope in the future that we will see some type of self-regulation from these digital platforms under pressure from the government and possibly some measure of cooperation amongst these firms. Okay, that is the key messages I'd like to convey today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cusimano, for sharing your insights. It's wonderful to hear about your research and the thought-provoking insights about digital platforms and regulations, self-regulation, and so forth. I'm sure we will have more questions from the audience, but first, let's hear the presentations from our speakers, and then we will come back to this issue. Our next speaker is Ms. Shayla Warren, who is the Deputy Head of the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Head of Data, Blockchain, and Digital Assets, and a member of the Executive Committee at the World Economic Forum. Ms. Warren's pioneering policy work is helping shape the data and technology spaces to be more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. Ms. Warren began her career as a Wall Street attorney at Cravath, Swaine, and Moore before turning to philanthropy and civic technology. She was a senior executive and general counsel at TechSoup, and she also designed and launched NGO Source, a groundbreaking service focused on international grant making. Ms. Warren currently serves on the boards of the ACLU of Northern California, the Equal Justice Society, and TechSoup, and on advisory boards for the World Bank, the OECD, and others. She is also the co-host of the popular show Money Reimagined on the CoinDesk Network. She is an honors graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Ms. Warren, thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to have you here, and you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, first of all, so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here today with these distinguished panel and distinguished guests. I will also share my screen and go here. I thought that I would run you today through just a quick overview of the frame of the work that we do here at the World Economic Forum on technology policy. And I think I loved the frame of this entire conversation about the light and shadow of innovative growth, because of course, that is exactly correct. And so part of what we focus on here at the forum is how do we create policies, governance, regulation that accelerate the benefits of innovation and mitigate the risks, recognizing that benefits and risks are present in any innovation. And a lot of times we don't have the foresight or ability, regardless of how much we're future planning or scenario planning, to understand, because things are moving in real time, the effects or the potential consequences of some of the work that we're doing, particularly when something is truly innovative as opposed to just disruptive. So as we say, the convergence of technologies here, we tend to look at technologies in isolation. So we say, oh, let's make policy about AI and machine learning, or policy about cryptocurrency, or policy about smart devices, or policies about surveillance, right? But really, it's the convergence of all of these different innovations that is shaping and changing the way that we interact with each other as a society. It's changing the way that governments provide services, changing the way that we think about a corporate structure and a business. It's changing the way we think about our relationships with our families, with our friends, and even how we identify ourselves. As we see things like the metaverse or Web3 or kinds of concepts that are not really common parlance and not really well understood by those outside of technical expertise, it's hard to understand how the ways that we engage with each other are profoundly changing for positive and negative. I think that when Web 2 was being developed, the centralized platform model that Professor Cusimano was talking about during his remarks, it was not really entirely foreseeable the kinds of biases that would be baked into those systems. Now, if we paid attention to other systems, legacy systems, our financial system, the way certain services operate, even telecommunications, we'd have understand that we're almost always creating an insider-outsider problem. We almost always are building technology or innovation in ways that benefit a certain part of society, often at the expense of another part of society. But as the world becomes more and more connected, through the internet and through new forms of innovation and new forms of technology and digital economy, it behooves us to be thinking in a more global way about our policies and to recognize that policies that we might make in one jurisdiction have a spillover effect more than they ever really did before. And nowhere is that more true than when it comes to digital economy. Now, it is my personal belief and the forum's belief that meaningful access to technology can actually provide empowerment and agency for people and communities. And this, I think, is a fundamental premise, but there's a huge caveat on that point. And the caveat is that if we are not mindful and thoughtful about how we actually engage in innovation, if we don't, we're not very careful and cautious about the kinds of opportunities we're providing, the thinking about equity, thinking about accessibility, what we're going to do is ever enhance the divide between what we colloquially call the haves and have-nots, and not just financially. Because I think we talk a lot about global equity and access to wealth. We talk in the United States here where I live about how during the pandemic, we had the very richest members of our society become even more separate from the rest of society, while the bottom 75% of American population lost wealth over the course of this pandemic. The very, very top 0.1% just absolutely cataclysmically enhanced their wealth creation. But it's about more than just access to wealth or hoarding of resources. It's also about access to the ways that enable us to participate in the global economy. We're seeing really interesting new models that are already converting innovations that were for purposes for which they were not intended. An example that I find really interesting is play to earn gaming happening in the Philippines as an example. So the Philippines, historically an economy that was based on a remittance flow, based on a lot of overseas kinds of activity with money coming back through a remittance corridor, is now seeing the opportunity for play to earn gaming to create financial reality, financial wealth and wealth creation within the society without the need for the emotional tax of moving across a border. And that's an example of something that started off as a fun game, but is now proving, at least in the short term, we'll see how this plays out with regulation, proving to actually be a means of actual wealth enhancement and creation that has an impact on society and family life. And so these kinds of things, I think, and encouraging this sort of innovation, encouraging an enabling environment in which technology is deployed in such a way that it can provide empowerment and agency is something that we should be thinking about when we think about how we're creating policy and regulation. Similarly, we have to think about society. So not just individual opportunities or even family or community opportunities for wealth generation or economic opportunity or other opportunity, but also how do we create policy that puts humans and communities at the center? So the forum had a pilot that we're running with the city of Helsinki and the capital of Finland, which is looking at if we take away the concept that we should be starting with a policy and then pushing it out and observing how it happens, but actually generating a policy from the ground up, focusing on the benefit to humans, what would that look like? Now, this is going to sound like a very simple example, but it's quite profound. So what the city did was they noticed that there was not significant uptake on free universal childcare, early childcare in certain parts of the city. So instead of requiring parents or caregivers to go in and enroll their children in these schools, they actually texted them proactively, telling them they were pre-enrolled in the school based on their geolocation or based on their commute patterns or based on their address. And then the parent could go in and change, if they wanted to, that particular location of that school based on their own information and the path that they were maybe commuting on or whatever it might be. But the pre-enrollment alone and the push out of that, rather than requiring a parent to pull down that information, had a profound effect on the uptake. And then the follow-on effect is that the city can then observe where is there more demand for these kinds of services and what other services might be useful to put in those similar places. So if you know that parents are largely going through a certain transit center, maybe that's where the school needs to be. Maybe you think about the traffic flow. Maybe you think about how you're doing your street lights or your transit to make access to that part of the neighborhood more effective or more more easy for parents and families. This can then have climate reduction effects as people are able to take a more efficient path to wherever they need to be during the course of the day. It can result in certain kinds of educational interventions that might be useful in a certain part of town or part of the city. So the simple act of just looking at what people really needed, which was busy, very hectic parents with new children needed to have this kind of done for them, have this service really offered up almost on a silver platter, has led to the development of other kinds of policies or potential creation of policies that have a very profound effect. So Helsinki and now Finland are thinking about how can we embed this approach, this as a design process in the creation of policies of everything from transit to childcare to health services to whatever it might be, voting access and things like this. So the fundamental just shift in frame can have very profound effects that are encourage and incentivize more pro-social behavior and result in more uptake on services that are actually quite appealing, but are just not rolled out in a way that anyone can actually make use of. And then it's important to also understand online harm. So we have a project at the forum we call Pathways to Digital Justice. And this is predicated on the realization that while harm can be identified and online harm is ever increasing, and this is everything from what they call revenge pornography to exploitation, catfishing as a phenomenon, all kinds of different things, or complete identity theft, ransomware, whatever it might be, it is very, very hard to locate within a legal system, most legal systems, where accountability lies. And so we created a project called Pathways to Justice. The idea is that it's probably not a linear path it's not like a situation where you can basically just identify a bad actor or perpetrator, sue them or whatever it might be, or expose them to criminal action or liability or fines, and then stop the harm. And the harm is ongoing, particularly because when it comes to something like the release of private information, it is almost impossible, usually it is impossible, to actually stop that information from spreading in a viral manner all over the internet. So once the harm exists online, you could assume that it really cannot be undone. How do you compensate or make somebody whole in that context? These are the kinds of things we should be thinking about when it comes to legal policies, thinking about our systems, because as more and more people are exposed to online harms, digital harms and data harms with higher and higher frequency at ever and ever younger ages, we as a global society need to think about the accountability we're building into the system and how we are incentivizing the creation of that harm. Right now, it's quite expensive. It's quite lucrative, rather, to be a perpetrator of this kind of harm. How do we flip that narrative? And so we're looking at that kind of as well. So in addition to kind of proactive policies incentivizing social behavior, we have to actually apply meaningful consequences and accountability to antisocial behavior at the same time. And those are often flip sides of the same coin, in line with the concept of the light and shadow of innovative growth. I thought I'd stop my remarks there. We have a lot of other work happening here at the forum. Again, exploring the convergence of technologies, everything from space tech to mobility, to smart devices, to blockchain and crypto. And I look forward to discussing that further on the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Shayla Warren. This was very insightful about online harm and justice about the digital world. We will see more of these issues as the metaverse world takes off. Our third speaker today is Dr. Daniel Suskin from Oxford University. Dr. Suskin is a fellow in economics and a senior research associate at the Institute for Ethics in AI at Oxford University and a visiting professor at King's College London. He is the co-author of the best-selling book, The Future of the Professions, and the author of A World Without Work, described by the New York Times as required reading for any potential presidential candidate thinking about the economy of the future. Thank you, Dr. Suskin, and all the speakers for such wonderful and insightful presentations. Finally, I'm honored to invite Professor Chang Gun Lee to lead our discussion with the speakers. Professor Chang Gun Lee worked at KDI, the Korean Development Institute, as an associate fellow in Yonsei University Mire campus before joining KDI School of Public Policy and Management. He earned a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan in 2015. He is an applied macroeconomist who focuses on industry and firms and the current digital transformation. Professor Lee will provide a brief overview and summary of each speaker's talk and a broad overview of the central overarching themes of the session. Professor Lee, please, the floor is all yours.
Okay, Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for the great presentations. They were all insightful and interesting, and they're thought-provoking. Uh, the presenters showed us how digitalization can give both opportunities and threats to the individuals, firms, industries, and societies. And even though the title of the session is Light and Shadows of Digitalization, I think we've seen more potential shadows of digitalization. So I think it's a great opportunity to think about what kind of challenges are ahead and what we should do. And all three presenters talked about the importance of incentives, right? So what can promote firms to form a coalition and try self-regulation, and how we can pursue some common good for the community, and what we can do to cope with the challenge of automation on the labor market. So I think we can use this time to think a little bit more about how we can utilize the force of markets, communities, and smart government policies to achieve some common good and some desirable outcomes. So I think we can start with Professor Guzmano's presentation, because he discussed and provided very good economic account of platform businesses. And so he explored the possibilities of effective regulation. And as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that the problem of disinformation and misinformation is quite serious. And platform business, the firms, they tried hard to correct this, and they tried some self-regulation, but obviously there was some excellent force, from the government to correct the misinformation problem. So Professor Guzmano, how do you think that the platform firms coped with the misinformation problem? And what does it show us? What should be the role of government? Is there any possibility for these firms to set up a good coalition so that we can tackle this problem during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Lee. That's a good summary. So we do think that government has to change some of its policies. We don't think, for example, that Section 230 should be appealed. It's important to have some sense that platforms are platforms, they're intermediaries, and not be totally responsible for, let's say, misdeeds on the platform by some actors. But there has to be some level of responsibility that they haven't had this far. We think, for example, that platforms should be held responsible and possibly forced or fined for revenue they earn or advertisements they earn connected to misinformation or disinformation, whether it's political or health related. Senior executives could be held personally responsible, even sued by the government Department of Justice, or even by individuals. At the moment, they are protected from many of those types of suits, at least in many interpretations. So we think that's possible. We do think that, like in the movie industry, companies can possibly set up some kind of set of rules, let's say for moderating political content or harmful content in other ways, like terrorist ads or bans, or create bans of some sort. That would require some cooperation among firms so that we level out the playing field. So we don't think the solution is government only, but government pressure with some more activities from companies themselves to regulate their activities and help their markets. If they don't do this, they will damage their credibility, our belief in content on the internet, and we think it will harm the use of the internet for many different purposes, information as well as commerce.
Okay.
Right? So the combination.
Yeah. Thank you for the answer. And I think we can go a step further into this problem because you gave us a really good explanation of the economics of platform businesses. So that helped us to identify the zone of self-regulation. So what kind of economic ideas should the policymakers have in spotting the timing of regulation and the goal of regulation and the ways of regulation?
Well, for example, all the social media platforms benefit generating billions and billions of dollars from misinformation that gets passed on. And they have introduced over the past year in particular some tags that saying this information is not reliable, for example. But there's a lot of evidence. I have a number of colleagues at MIT studying this, that misinformation circulates far more rapidly and widely than actual news. Spectacular stories go viral very quickly. So there's no clawing back or penalty on those kinds of revenues. And that's what makes it very difficult for these companies to regulate themselves, because when they start putting tags or closing accounts, they depress the network effects that surround this type of content and interaction among users, and then also advertisers or third-party app developers. But there's got to be some economic consequence, otherwise we think these firms will not listen. And one other point here, in the movie industry, it actually turned out good for them to give ratings on movies of R or parental guidance, for example. They created a broader audience rather than have some people mistrust movies or the potential content. There was a rating system that gave some guidance to parents. So we think the coalition of firms coming together, establishing a code of conduct essentially and a rating system improved movies, radio content. We've also seen it in advertising. But again, firms do not do this voluntarily. They have to see that it's in their self-interest. And in other cases, they need to be pressured by government. The threat of more regulation if it doesn't exist.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we can connect this topic to the second presentation. So this question goes to Ms. Warren. So Professor Kuzimano's presentation addressed the problem of technology and platform governance. So I believe that there must be something similar in the area of like the role of digital innovations in communities and society. So what are the some of the emerging suggestions on how governments can navigate the delicate kind of balance between policies to promote digital innovations and the mitigation of risk that these technologies pose to society?
I think that's exactly, you cracked the nut of it. That's exactly the balance that I think everyone needs to strike. And I think it begins with what is the harm you're trying to prevent and being very specific about that. There tends to be this kind of general hand waving, about things, or there tends to be maybe one specific incident happens and that becomes kind of the focal point of all regulations. It's kind of a major talking point. So if you think about, for example, Bitcoin, for example, right? So there's this whole, Bitcoin and, criminals or whatever, for a little while, that was kind of a talking point. So there was this concern around the ability of Bitcoin, criminals to use Bitcoin for illicit activity, and so if you over-index on something like that, then you risk, basically stifling a lot of innovation at the in the process while you're trying to basically mitigate a very specific and particular harm, which may not even necessarily be a widespread harm. So it starts with kind of what is your policy agenda? What is it you're trying to prevent from having happen? And then being, I think, as prescribed as possible about that, recognizing that any policy is going to have a chilling effect. It is a symbiotic relationship between innovation and policy. So policy shapes the direction of travel of any innovation, and you have to be very, very thoughtful about not creating a penumbral effect or too big of a shadow, if you will, from the regulation that's what you're targeting, and actually having that overflow into a lot of other areas. Now, the other thing I think is important to note is that with any innovation, you are always, almost always, let's say, 99% of the time, let's say, definitionally, if you are looking to pre-existing policy and trying to model new forward-thinking policy on current policy, then you're always trying to shove a square peg into a round hole. Because by definition, the thing that is emerging is not yet fully defined, and it wouldn't be interesting if it fits squarely into what came before. So I think that the history of the internet is something that's talked about a lot, how we came to regulate the internet in the United States, what we did and didn't do, and the consequences therefrom, and all of that kind of thing. But the new wave of decentralized systems, again, to go with this example, is not exactly like the internet. It has some significant differences from the internet. And those differences are actually what makes it interesting. And at the same time as those can lead to risk, can lead to enhanced instances of potential bad actors having new ways of exploiting vulnerable populations or people, that can also, on the flip of that, is provide empowerment and agency to those very same individuals. And so I think it's just important to understand that you can't make good regulation quickly. And you can't make it by solely modeling it after what came before.
Okay, and if I have a follow-up question about communications. I mean, when technologies are new, it's hard to regulate and set up policies. It's also difficult to let people know about the potential benefits and risk of new technology. Like when it comes to Bitcoin, like many teenagers and youngsters, they don't even want to know about the technical characteristics of Bitcoin. They're so much interested in the kind of speculation, right? So what should be the role of the government in technological communication with the public? I mean, should they like set a model to, teach or give some lessons to students? What is your opinion on this? Yes.
So I'll take it two ways. So first of all, I think it is important for those who are making policy about a thing to understand the thing. I do not necessarily think it's important, for instance, it's going to be kind of radical and maybe odd to say, but I don't actually think it's that important for users of a thing to fully understand the details of how that thing works. The same way that I am not a mechanic, I do not actually understand, my husband will tell you, a thing about how my car drives on the road, but I know how to drive it. And that is the level of engagement I need to have. What I need to know is how to drive my car safely. And here in the United States, we have certain rules of the road. I know I stop at a traffic light, I buckle my seatbelt, I do certain things that are designed to minimize my risk of engagement with that vehicle. Similarly, with technologies, you may not know exactly how your VR or a VR headset or AR glasses work. Like, what is the signal? Where does it go? What's the data going into it? But you do need to understand how to ensure that when you're in an immersive environment, you're not walking around and falling off a mountain, right? You need to understand the parameters in which you can more safely use that device. Right? So I think that is the role of policy, is not necessarily to get into the deep education with end users about the details of their technology. I think most people who send a text really don't know how that works, or who send an email don't really understand the mechanics behind it, TCP/IP. They don't really get it, but they understand what spam is. They understand what a spam blocker is. They understand maybe how to prevent ads from popping up, or whatever it might be, right? There are these kinds of things. So I think you have to be thoughtful about what is useful in terms of understanding and education. Now, that being said, I also think that a lot of digital economy and the global economy is going to move towards tech-enabled interactions. And so I do think that as a society, putting some sort of premium or whatever it will, or encouragement around education in these topics is potentially important. And that probably depends on where you are and the kind of way you see your economy developing or your role in the global economy. But I do think that encouraging that kind of curiosity is important. And I do think that having us start from the top and having leaders who are in favor of science and technology and speak favorably about science and technology as being something that can be pro-social is quite positive and productive.
Great. I have another follow-up question. I think this can go to Professor Guzmano or Ms. Warren, because in Korea, when COVID-19 came, the government and internet platform providers, they closely work together to provide the right correct information about the pandemic, and also provide some technical foundation for tracking and collecting information from the people. So I believe there could be some good model of how business is involved in promoting like public awareness and improving digital literacy and solving social problems. So probably Professor Kuzmano can give us a good example or give us some insights about the possibility, and Ms. Warren can also share her opinion about this.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think you're right that social media sites were critical in relaying information, Facebook, for example, in particular. But initially, they were somewhat slow to recognize and do something about the misinformation that was being circulated. And there still is a lot of misinformation on the web, but they've been trying to curb it. But it takes thousands of people and the kinds of technology that we heard about from Professor Suskin to moderate through this content, and it never works perfectly. But then they also have the economic conflict of interest that all this misinformation and spectacular information generates advertisements and billions of dollars. But we did see some effort to curb the information and present better information. And today you do see much more curbs and accounts removed from people that are spreading misinformation. We also saw Google and Apple as smartphone technology vendors make an alert system possible for users. I have one on my phone, for example. If someone tests positive, that information is relayed to the state government and I get an alert on my phone. But that's only in my state of Massachusetts. We have people that oppose that kind of use of technology more broadly, and so we don't see it broadly. But, and I think in Japan and Korea, the technology of smartphones was used more effectively than in the United States for those kinds of alerts.
Sure, and I'll just chime in to add, we at the forum, we have an initiative called the Data for Common Purpose Initiative, and we're actually privileged to have a fellow from KAIST who's working on this initiative. And I think that what we're trying to point out to this initiative, which has some very concrete, practical elements and outputs, is to basically say that in our rabid quest to preserve privacy, particularly around things like health data, which obviously is very private data, we have a bit thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And so there are instances, and sort of the types that Professor Kuzmano cites, where people are not only willing, they're eager to share information, provided it's sufficiently encrypted and anonymized and untraceable to them and whatnot, about things like COVID transmission or their particular demographic, so that they can be more understanding by scientists or vaccine developers or whatever it might be around the spread and transmission of this virus, or for other similar related reasons, flu, as well. And in our quest to preserve privacy, we have almost cut off their ability in some cases to share that information, which they might be very willing to do. And so part of what this initiative is focusing on is basically saying, look, it is not so much that I, as a person who generates, as a data subject, someone who generates data, care about who has access to that data. What I really care about is what are they using it for? So I might be very comfortable with even a centralized platform, social media, using my information for purposes that I have approved, provided I understand then where that data goes, or using my data in the aggregate, right, to provide some kind of insight related to a health crisis or whatever it might be, or disaster or situation, or whatever it might be. But that exact same information, I might have absolute negative reaction to a corporation using it to generate a product that they're going to sell back to me, whatever it might be, or even for ads, right? So it's not the information itself, it's really the context in which that information is going to be used, by whom, what for how long, et cetera. And we actually, with new technological innovations, we have the ability to be more precise about what data can go where and how and whatnot. And so we need to kind of anticipate that that is a world that is coming, that there are elements of what we call Web3, these more kind of user-oriented or focused approaches to data and data collection, data usage, that may not ever be fully realized, but we're kind of on a path in that direction, and there are innovations happening. And I think our policy needs to anticipate that that is something that eventually will have more fluidity and flexibility. People will be able to have this kind of targeting as to what is done with their information. And that's not a world that we're in at the moment.
Great. I think now it's time to touch on the last topic, and then I think we can invite some questions from online or offline audience. So, Dr. Suskin, I remember I read a paper. I think it was published in Journal of Economic Perspective. So it was about the history of work, automation, and the public response. And I remember that the author said that in the times of Industrial Revolution, the real concern was not about losing jobs, but more about work being dehumanized. And you actually touched on this issue out of 3 challenges you mentioned. So what do you think about this kind of hypothesis? That the real problem is not losing our jobs, but more about changing nature of work.
Yes, I think it's a really important observation. Let me just make one broad observation, which is that one of the unhelpful things that we do when we talk about the impact of technology on the labor market is that we often talk in terms of jobs. How many jobs are going to be created? How many jobs are going to be destroyed? But the number of jobs that there are for people to do is not the only margin on which the world of work adjusts to technological change. It's not only the number of jobs that might change, but also the nature of those jobs. Not just the pay either, but also the quality, the status, the flexibility. There are many dimensions in which the quality of a job might run, and dimensions in which technology might have a harmful impact on that work. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that when we're thinking about the impact of technology on work, it's not just the number of jobs, but it's the nature. It's not just the quantity of jobs, but it's the quality. And it goes to this point that you're making. But I do think we tend not to be very good at thinking about the relationship between work and meaning. In my view, I don't think we have a particularly good understanding of the relationship between work and meaning, either the relationship that exists today, which I think is far more ambiguous and far less clear than many people commonly suppose, but also how people's relationships to work have changed over time. You can find people having very different relationships to the work that they do at different moments in history. And one of the things I spend a lot of time doing in that new book, A World Without Work, is trying to interrogate a bit more closely this relationship between work and meaning, because I do think it's very important.
All right. And you also mentioned the impact of growing political power of large corporations. And actually that's resonates with changing perception toward labor union. I mean, young generation is honestly in Korea, they're becoming more negative about labor union. And I believe that that's associated with the waves of digitization, because it changes the rules of every economic activities. So what do you think the role of labor unions and traditional labor movement in the era of digitalization?
The great American economist J.K. Galbraith had a phrase where he talked about countervailing power. The idea that in an economy you want to, where there are concentrations of power, you want to have countervailing power elsewhere. And it seems to me that in a world where large technology companies are gaining more and more power, whether it's economic power or indeed political power, it is important that workers are able to wield countervailing power in response. And it seems to me that the sorts of trends that you're describing, declining support for unions, particularly among young people, it's problematic in the sense that it suggests that that countervailing power is not there. But it's also, I think, a challenge to those traditional unions, because if we're honest, the way in which many unions work, despite the importance of what they do fundamentally, the problem that they solve, the ways in which they work haven't changed for decades. Unions continue to represent workers and their grievances and seek influence in much the same way they did many decades ago, despite the existence of many technological alternatives. And so I think it's a great challenge to many unions to use technology themselves to make themselves more clearly known as a solution to the problem that many workers currently face. And when I see young people falling out of, when I see young people looking less favorably among unions, it seems to me that that is indicative that these organizations are not seen by young people as solving the sorts of problems that they face in their lives. And I think that is a real shame, because they are precisely the sorts of problems that these workers face.
All right. And lastly, you also said that the pandemic was a period we kind of experimented. We were forced to experiment with new digital technologies. So what should be the takeaways for policymakers? I mean, because it gave us a chance to see what happens if we utilize digital technologies. So what should we learn from this experience, in your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, we're still in this experience. So I think that the stage we're at remains, as we would with any pilot or any experiment, trying to gather as much data and as much evidence as we can on what's currently taking place. So once the pandemic eventually does fade, we're able to make informed and sensible decisions about the future. But I think at the moment, many people aren't seeing this as, many people quite understandably are treading water. They're just trying to get through, just trying to survive, just trying to keep going, rather than seeing this as an opportunity to learn, and when particularly thinking about technology, how we can use technology to work very differently. So one of the things I encourage many business leaders to do is to be gathering as much evidence and experience, as much evidence and insight as they can on what is and what is not working well. Talking to one another, talking to clients, talking to employees, trying to get a sense of what is and what is not working. Again, so that once the pandemic eventually fades, we're able to make informed decisions based on the experience of the last 18 to 24 months. I think it's too soon, though, to be drawing any conclusions. As I said, the pandemic is not over yet. We are very much still in evidence gathering mode.
Great. Yeah.
Let me just follow up on that. So, Dr. Susskind, your books are described as required readings for any presidential candidate, according to the New York Times. The vast majority of the voters may have not seen your TED Talk, let alone reading your books. And they all want to hear jobs, jobs, jobs from a presidential candidate. So if there's one advice that you would give to a presidential candidate, what should that candidate say to the general public to reassure that the future of work and still get the support and love from their people?
So just to be clear, you're suggesting that voters.
Is there any advice that you would give a presidential candidate on what he or she should say to the voters about the future of work to reassure them?
Yeah. Well, so I suppose the first thing that any political leader ought to be doing is taking the sorts of problems that I've described seriously. I don't think the challenges of automation and the challenges of technological disruption are problems that loom in the distant future, out of sight, things we don't need to worry about now. I think we can already catch a glimpse of some of this disruption unfolding in particular parts of our lives already today. And it's something to not shy away from. So I think for politicians and for policymakers in general, the most important task is to confront and engage this problem rather than try and kick it into the long policy grass. In terms of voters, I think first be honest about the nature of the challenge, and it is a challenge. But I think also be clear that the challenge that we face for the next 5-10 years or so is not a challenge where there aren't enough jobs for people to do, full stop. As I said at the start, I don't think that's the challenge at all. The challenge is that there is going to be work for people to do, but for various reasons, they're not going to be able to take up that work. And there are various reasons why those mismatches might exist, why people might not be able to do the work that has to be done. But it's so I think that's potentially something encouraging that could be said to voters and to workers worrying about work. The challenge is not that there's not going to be enough jobs. The challenge is how governments can help people into the work that's going to have to be done. And it's up to governments and policymakers to design the sorts of interventions that are going to support workers into those roles.
Thank you very much. We can now open up the floor and get some questions from the audience. So if there's anyone who would like to ask questions directly to our speakers, please feel free to raise your hands. And if there are any questions online, I think we could take some questions via Zoom chat room or the YouTube chat room. Okay. Otherwise, I could ask a common question to all three speakers. So let me start with Dr. Kusumano. So you talked about digital platforms, regulation, and self-regulation. Is there any final advice that you would like to give to any government to promote the innovations that these digital platforms bring to the society, but at the same time mitigate the dark side of these digital platforms, which is the overarching theme of today's session?
Well, I'm not quite sure what to say on that, but it's finding that balance between recognizing the good that these platforms do. They enable commerce or information exchange in a way that was never possible. For example, we're having this conference, right, with people. We're attending from all around the world. We're doing it instantaneously. We're looking at each other. This is sitting on top of a platform, and Zoom is one of the newer communications platforms that's been developed. So obviously, we could have spent the entire session talking about the good things that platforms do. So what we want to do is just understand, identify the excesses, and find ways to, I think, make it in the self-interest of these platforms to curb some of those excesses. But on a broader issue, just getting back to what Daniel has been talking about, every time we've had a technological revolution, we've had people worried about replacing workers. I mean, this goes back 200 years. And also in this century, we've had people worrying about replacing workers. We've had worries about commodification or the dehumanizing of work. And I think each time we've seen a transition period, and we've come out of it in some way. So right now we have tremendous demand for new types of workers, artificial intelligence programmers and software programmers. And that's part of the advice to governments to invest in retraining your workforces or in education that helps move populations and economies towards the more modern world. We're not going to be able to automate everything. If we look at economic or at least labor transfers over years, 90% of labor was involved in agriculture 150 years ago. But today, about 80% of labor force is involved in services of different types. So there are things that probably we won't automate. What are those? Can we train workers to do that? And find meaning in that work. And that's often a personal challenge and not just a technological obstacle. So again, there's a lot of things we need to advise governments on, but also companies, and that's part of the self-regulation, and also educators. And that's a mission for all of us, I think.
Thank you. Education and a forum like this will definitely help that effort. Ms. Warren, let me ask you a slightly different question. So we all know that fairness is a really important concept, but fairness also means different things to different people. So with that in mind, if you were to give one recommendation to the government where the government policymakers are trying to balance the digital innovative growth versus promoting fairness in society, is there any insight or advice that you might give in trying to balance those two concepts?
Well, I would first start by maybe questioning the premise and saying I think that fairness is subjective. It's very hard to think of an objective framework on fair, and I think that anybody who's spent some time in kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces will kind of understand what I mean when I say that. I think that fair and equitable are different concepts, and I would certainly encourage a transition into thinking about equity and accessibility over fundamental just kind of fairness. But if we use more of a colloquial definition of fairness, I think you have to examine, where people are starting from. And so you can't assume a level playing field when you enact any kind of policy. That applies when you think about competition law, for example. Competition law, there's a tendency to bias towards existing companies and kind of create a frame around the ways that they do business, which creates a barrier to new entrants. And so one of the big protests that arises around competition laws or even a monopoly or antitrust is that it tends to just bias in favor of existing organizations at the expense of new entrants to a system, even though fundamentally antitrust is about preventing barriers to competition and barriers to entry that can enable or rather make it harder for monopolies to thrive and flourish. Similarly, I think when it comes to a lens on fairness, recognizing that not everyone is starting in the same place, not every community or every part of society or every individual is starting in the same place. And so it really comes down to what are the goals. If the goals are to provide equal opportunity, well, sometimes that means you have to actually stack a deck a little bit to ensure that there is a little bit more equity in the initiation of whatever the initiative might look like or the innovation that's going to be rolled out might be. At the same time, it may be that that is not the focus, that the end user, the citizen, whatever, the consumer, may not be the focus. It may be more similar to what I was talking about in terms of a corporate leveling, right? So then you have to take a lens a little bit more that looks at monopolies and other kinds of systems that we have deemed as society, at least in certain societies, not to be pro-social or productive. So then you have to kind of take a little bit of a different boost. And so then there's the question around, well, do you create incentives? Greening of energy or clean energy or electric vehicles or subsidies or credits or whatever it might be, tax breaks. Those are things and levers that the United States political infrastructure has used at times to promote or spur innovation in certain sectors using certain kinds of resources that may be otherwise too expensive to actually enter into the ordinary business calculations. But with the subsidy, they become more equitable or fair or level or whatever it might be. So I would say these are complicated questions, but as usual, it always begins with what is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the harm you're trying to prevent or address? And if you don't have a very clear picture of what that is, then it is not only impossible to develop a concept of what fairness or equity really means in that context, it is literally impossible to regulate in favor of it.
Thank you very much for your insight. All right. Dr. Suskin, so you touched upon the topic about slowly but surely technology, AI, robotics will create more jobs, and there will be a number of jobs existing in the society. However, in the short run, there might be a lot of people who don't match those new skills, so they may have to be sometimes laid off, sometimes be educated to fit the new jobs. But at least in the short run, there might be some short-term pain for a certain population of the workforce. So from that perspective, is there any advice that you could give to the government on how we should deal with this population who no longer has the skill set that matches this new digital age, or maybe even to the firms that may have to lay them off?
Yeah. Well, this tends to be the conversation about automation, which is how do we provide the people that you're talking about with the skills and with the capabilities to do the work that has to be done. And that's partly thinking through what we teach, what sorts of skills and capabilities. It's partly thinking through how we teach. The ways in which we teach people haven't really changed much for decades, despite the existence of many technological alternatives. And it's also about when we teach. Very strong cultural presumption in most societies that education is the sort of thing you do at the start of your life. That's when you spend the time, the effort, the resources building up your so-called human capital, and then you don't need to worry too much about it again. And I think that's where a lot of the debate is. It's about how we ought to engage with the what, the how, and the when of educating and retraining workers for the jobs that have to be done. I suppose, though, I think the picture is a little more complex. I mean, the reasons that people are unable to get the work that has to be done aren't really just about skills. It's not just about skills mismatch. I think there are also, just more prosaically, place mismatches, that people happen to not live in the sort of geographical location where work is being created. I think that's very important, particularly for certain types of blue-collar role, which are very dependent upon thriving demand in particular physical spaces. But I also think there are issues around identity mismatch, that people have a particular conception of themselves and they're willing to stay unemployed in order to protect that identity. South Korea is a very interesting example. Incredibly high proportion of the unemployed have college degrees. Now, the reason those people are unemployed is not because there isn't work for them to do. It's because the work that is available isn't the sort of work that they feel that they were preparing in life to do. Those are mismatches that aren't so much about skills or even about place. They're about identity. And I think those sorts of mismatches are very important. So I think there are limits to education in responding to the challenge of automation. There are limits to that traditional conversation that we have about, okay, well, we just need some more education. And if we get the education right, then that will solve the problem. I think that'll get us a lot of the way, but I think there are other problems at play here too as well.
Thank you very much. That's very insightful about the geolocation, the skill set, and the identity of these people who are in the workforce. Do we have any questions from the floor? Okay. Professor Lee, would you like to have a final comment?
No, the only thing I can say is that I really enjoyed this session and I learned pretty much from all speakers. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I have certainly learned a lot. It was very insightful. So thank you to all the speakers for joining us today. And thank you to all the viewers who are joining us online and watching us via Zoom. Now I'll hand over to the conference moderator for the next steps of the forum.
Thank you very much, Professor Beck and Professor Lee, to be kindly present here to host the session number 3.